Good afternoon, everybody. Indeed, a pleasure to have all of you with us today at this very fascinating and important conversation called Vichitra, Queer Conversations. We were speaking about what this title means. What could it mean when we say something is queer? There are ways in which we define the word, and especially in the last few years, our vocabulary is expanding. And we are defining and redefining terms and interpreting them in our own ways. So before we actually go into the nitty-gritties of the conversation, let's first clear out the title for all of us and what it means to all of us individually. What is a queer conversation? What is queer writing? What is being queer? Shyam, I would like to start with you.
A great start with the old guy. Um, I mean, what isn't queer? Can we start there? I think that, I mean, for me, obviously, historically, when I came out in the 1980s, it was just gay. You were gay or lesbian. You weren't even allowed to be bisexual. If you were, you should supposed to shut up about it and be, with us. So things have changed over time, and especially in a Canadian context, we have many more rights. And now we have the trans movement, which is experiencing a lot of transphobia, which is very disturbing. And I suppose for me as a gay man, those 80s were a very difficult period, but they were also a very period that felt very alive. And what I loved about it was how this idea of fluidity, like the fluidity of your body, the fluidity of your sexuality, of your movement, of your clothing. Our icons were people like David Bowie, and and then the gay movement got kind of very staid once we started to get rights, and I think it began to fulfill James Baldwin's prediction for the gay movement, which is basically, he said, white men at some point when they began to have sexual feelings realized that the privilege that they thought they was naturally theirs wasn't theirs, so the gay movement was an attempt to secure those privileges. So once they secured those privileges, I thought the gay movement became both dull but also inwardly, sort of not really political, very political. Now the trans movement has started, and it's brought, I think, fluidity and back into into queer lives. And so as this old cis gay guy, I've also had to learn, I've also had to learn about this movement and learn from these young people and begin to look at how, how I learned when I was 13 to control the fluidity of my movements in order to be safe, basically, in school, later, in the gay areas, leaving the pubs and going home. So I'm sort of now beginning to reclaim that way of walking and being and carrying my bag, my purse. I don't have a purse, but you know what I mean? And it's not about being feminine or masculine for me. It's about being fluid and allowing that into your life in many ways. So I think that's the great gift of the queer movement to the world, is fluidity.
That's actually a very good word to pick on, fluidity, and this awareness, almost the hyper awareness that also comes with it. Once you embrace your fluidity, it's not it's a given that now you are completely confident and without threat. We've spoken about this, that even if you're walking from one venue to another, as people who are oppressed, as queer people, as women, we are very conscious of our own selves, our own identity, and the gazes that surround us. Gazes, as in the lens. But Ishani, on fluidity, you speak about how gender shouldn't be this, dominant pillar of identity. You write from both the lens of a woman, and your book has a protagonist that never really speaks of his queerness. But yet you are here in a conversation called Vichitra, Queer Conversations. So tell us, queerness, what does it mean for you?
Hi, thanks. As you've said, I've almost stumbled upon this conversation. I'm kind of finding myself here almost by accident. So I'm going to answer that question in the context of my novel. And sort of almost walk in the footsteps of my main character, Moyu. So Moyur is a boy who he has two lives. He has his own life that he has to fulfill, but he's actually also living the life of his unborn, unwanted twin sister. So he has expressions that belong both to him, but also to the unfulfilled potential of his twin sister. So he likes to dance, he likes to wear makeup, he likes to wear saris, and so he's not conforming to what would be traditionally considered male. He's sort of embodying both the male and the female sort of stereotypes. And so whilst I didn't write this in that paradigm of gender identity, I wrote it in the paradigm of a boy with two souls. Actually, and so he doesn't self-identify as queer, but the world around him, they can't quite make sense of him. He's not conforming, he is misunderstood, he is not normal, and therefore he has to navigate that, and he has to somehow realize both of those destinies, but holding that kind of position in tension. So I guess it's about not conforming, and it's also in that sense, a nod to fluidity, to not be bound by certain expectations.
Anish, boundless and to not conform. Would you define the queer experience with those terms?
In some ways, right? I think for me, queerness also derives from a policing of desire, right? And I think queerness, for me, has always been understood through very complex negotiations with desire. For me, James Baldwin's Giovanni's Room, I think, was one of the first books that taught me more about queerness than I ever knew before. It was sort of putting voice to feelings that I'd had while coming out. This sort of tumultuous, contentious sort of engagement and entanglement with desire that defines queerness. And I think that allows you to then see queerness outside of books written by or about queer characters. Someone like Anais Nin and her diaries have been such phenomenal insights into queerness. And this policing of desire that operates, of course, at the level of the state, which is a lot of the work that I do, which is with Thinkless and the government, but also on more sort of subtler levels, within families, within yourself, within intimate relationships. So I think this entanglement with desire is what defines queerness to me. And I think it animates so many of these conversations, including around the sort of refusal to acknowledge trans rights today, in so many of the conversations around the refusal to even grant a further degree of acceptance to queerness today. And I think desire somehow sits at the center of queerness for me.
And I'm glad that you bring up the topic of reading. Actually, that is something that the three of you brought in when I asked you about the queer experience, and that reading has also helped each one of us, not only reading, but locating queer icons too, right? There are certain people, you talked about David Bowie, and we have certain places where we go for reassurance, perhaps, to say, my experience is not isolated, wherein you see for the longest time, let's talk about history, for example, the narratives have been so heteronormative that you feel like, does this history not belong to you? Are we not a part of this story? But it's interesting to talk about books. Ishani, 10 years to The Dancing Boy. Shyam, 20 years to Funny Boy. And what I wanted to talk about is that when people who are oppressed, when they write, of course there is the bug of the writer. You write because you must write, there's nothing else that you can do. But also when you write about these experiences, when you document those, what is that space that it's coming out of? Is it frustration for the world? It's to give voice to that misunderstanding and a voice to the misunderstood, so that they read it and they realize there is someone out there, because 10 years, 20 years later, we are still here talking about your books that really struck a chord with many queer people across the world. So what is it about writing these experiences? Shyam?
Well, I mean, you are as a writer, so I'm a writer first, right? I mean, and so what I want to do is write novels that are like the novels I love to read. So the novels I love to read are novels that look at the multiple grays of existence, and are also novels that are not polemical. So I'm not really interested in polemical novels, and I'm not interested in writing it. So in writing, say, Funny Boy, what I thought about was growing up in Sri Lanka and how there was this silence. That my desire was echoing only to myself. And I wanted to, I had this dream, I suppose, this vision, this idea that some young queer writer would pick up my book and read it and think, okay, I'm seen, and I'm seen with love and gentleness and affection. The last thing a person wants to do, a last thing somebody like that should have to feel is that they're being hectored by some writer, with their own political agenda. Now, I do have a political agenda, but I transfer it to other stuff like, activism or whatever, speaking out, or being the first person in Sri Lanka to come out in public and say I was gay. But the books themselves must be, for me, some sort of gentle and immersive engagement. Otherwise, they're not books I really want to write.
Ishani, your book is an ode to womanhood first, if you agree with me.
Yeah.
And it captures this experience wherein for so many gay men who aspire to be something that they see in somebody else, this could be something as simple as donning on an outfit, that is considered to be typically feminine, that you would want to take out a sari from your mother's closet and try it on before anybody else comes home. We will go to the readings actually in a bit, but before that, who are you writing for and who are you giving voice to? Because this boy in your book is actually speaking, as you said, through the soul of his unborn sister. So it is an ode to womanhood too. So what is it?
Thanks. So when I initially constructed the novel, the central character was actually Moina, who is the unborn twin sister. And actually the book was, when I had written it, I had given it the title Moina Stolen Dances. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say that, but that's what it was called, and it really reflects my intention in shining a light on the very sort of pervasive experience of women and girls in that they are curtailed. In her case, it was an extreme manifestation. Her life was curtailed. She never got to be born. She never got to live. But then there are other characters, other women in the novel who also, are curtailed either through lack of being able to pursue their dreams in terms of education or fulfill their destiny in other ways. And actually, Moyur is the same, and I find that there is a resonance there in that many of the characters, because of the expectations placed upon them, are unable to be who they wanted to be, or they were not free to become the people that they could have been. And that is certainly something that I wanted to follow through, and is still sort of coming through in the book. Yeah.
Anish, we just spoke about time, right? 20 years, 10 years. And a lot has also changed in this period in terms of queer politics, in terms of vocabulary, in terms of how we are now rightfully accommodating, and not even accommodating, realizing the importance of conversations such as these. You have been closely working with politics, and you've been archiving, sort of making an archive of how representative and inclusive are parties of queerness and queer politics. What have the last few years taught you about the queer experience within the political spectrum of India?
One sits in an uneasy space in the literary and then in the political, which are sort of very distinct from each other. And I think over the last 20 years, you have seen vast amounts of progress, and you have seen the fruits of activism bear out. You've seen something like the overturning of Section 377 through a long and contentious court battle. You've seen a problematic Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Act, which has flaws but still exists in a country like India. providing certain rights to trans folks. And you've really got into a space where queer and trans people have a certain space in the public sphere, right? And there's a part of my work that addresses that, works towards that, and is engaged in activism that requires a certain writing of, that requires a writing of a certain kind and a mobilization of a certain kind. At the same time, if you see the repercussions of this work on daily lived realities, their impact becomes slightly unclear. So someone I've been translating for a while now is Aligarh Muslim University professor Ramchandra Siras, who the movie Aligarh was also based on, but who was a Marathi poet who died under mysterious circumstances after being outed at the university and having the university administration come down heavily against him. And his poetry is spectacular, right? And writes about a certain sense of queer loneliness that comes from not being able to be yourself. And Siras writes when 377 is not in place. He writes in those intervening years. For those of you those of you who know a little bit about the trajectory of the anti-sodomy law, which criminalized carnal intercourse against the order of nature in India, between 2009 and 2013, when a lower court had struck it down. And Siras, despite having access to, one would say, a legal recourse that does not criminalize his existence, does not have access to societal recourse. So I think the last 20 years have been powerful in terms of the changes that have come through. I think, as Shyam pointed out, these have also been difficult times. I think you're seeing a rise in transphobia, right? I think you're seeing a setting back of the movement in some ways. You're also seeing more difficult ways in which queerness has to contend with its appropriation. We're seeing pinkwashing at alarming levels across the world, that queerness is not necessarily a radical force, that queerness is not necessarily a progressive movement, and it can be sort of molded and maneuvered to various ends. So I think keeping all of those things in mind, it's been an interesting time to see what the role of activism is, whether something like a queer movement can exist, and what that does to the sort of idea of a queer aesthetics that's getting dramatically transformed today.
Thank you, Anish. And I would like to actually pick on a word that you used, even queer loneliness. And I do think, though, even if literature and politics perhaps work in their own silos, they're also deeply connected. Of course they are. And sometimes these books are able to speak of experiences that you think are only felt by you, and you feel alienated in that process. We spoke earlier about this whole idea of being so conscious and hyper-aware of your identities as queer people, still navigating life, still coming on stage and speaking. You're still somewhere thinking, oh, well, what kind of a gaze is present in the audience? Who are you speaking to? But we still, through our words, in spaces where you're to yourself and you're writing in your rooms, in that privacy, you're able to give that experience words, and that experience is read by people and they feel, oh, well, there is my story. I would like to now actually ask Shyam and Ishani, Shyam first, to read from Funny Boy, and then Ishani from The Dancing Boy.
So the novel came out of a writing exercise I was doing of a boy watching his mother put on her sari. And then when I got to the end of the page, I realized, oh, the boy wants to wear the sari. And then I followed the book from there. And curiously, this scene has, I hear from readers, whether they're queer or non-queer, male or female, that South Asian readers, that this scene really resonates with them, watching your mother put on her sari. So I thought I'd read this scene. And all you should know is that Aji, the protagonist, has been caught dressed as a bride, playing bride with his girl cousins, and his father, as fathers tend to do, has blamed the mother for this. So the mother is now under some sort of pressure. So I'll just read the sari scene. Of the three of us, I alone was allowed to enter Amma's bedroom and watch her get dressed for special occasions. It was an experience I considered almost religious, for even though I adored the goddesses of the local cinema, Amma was the final statement in female beauty for me. When I knew Amma was getting dressed for a special occasion, I always positioned myself outside her door. Once she had put on her underskirt and blouse, she would ring for our servant Anula to bring her sari, and then, while taking it from her, hold the door open so I could go in as well. Entering that room was, for me, a greater boon than that granted by any god to a mortal. There were two reasons for this. The first was the jewelry box, which lay open on the dressing table. With a joy akin to ecstasy, I would lean over and gaze inside, the faint smell of perfume rising out of the box each time I picked up a piece of jewelry and held it against my nose or ears or throat. The second was the pleasure of watching Amma drape her sari. Watching her shake open the yards of material, which, like a Chinese banner caught by the wind, would linger in the air for a moment before drifting gently to the floor. Watching her pick up one end of it, tuck it into the waistband of her skirt, make the pleats, and then with a flick of her wrists, invert the pleats and tuck them into her waistband. And finally watching her drape the palu across her breasts and pin it into place with a brooch. When Amma was finished, she would check to make sure that the back of the sari had not risen up with the pinning of the palu, then move back and look at herself in the mirror. Standing next to her or seated on the edge of the bed, I too would look at her reflection in the mirror, and with the contented sigh of an artist who has finally captured the exact effect he wants, I would say, "You should have been a film star, Amma." "A film star," she would cry and lightly smack the side of my head. "What kind of a low-class type person do you think I am?" One day, about a week after the incident at my grandparents', I positioned myself outside my parents' bedroom door. When Anula arrived with the sari, Amma took it and quickly shut the door. I waited patiently, thinking Amma had not yet put on her blouse and skirt. But the door never opened. Finally, perplexed that Amma had forgotten, I knocked timidly on the door. She did not answer, but I could hear her moving around inside. I knocked a little louder and called out, "Amma," through the keyhole. Still no response. And I was about to call out her name again when she replied gruffly, "Go away, can't you see I'm busy?" I stared disbelievingly at the door. Inside, I could hear the rustle of the sari as it brushed along the floor. I lifted my hand to knock again when suddenly I remembered the quarrel I had heard on that last Spender day between my parents. My hand fell limply by my side.
Thank you, Shyam. Ishani. Even Ishani speaks of a sari and a boy.
Yeah, so coincidentally, I've also picked a sari scene. And I've already explained a little bit who Moyur is. So this piece follows Moyur also donning a sari and a little bit more. Oh, I should just explain as well that Moyur works in a sari shop. So that's where he is when we encounter him. Moyur pulled the rolling metal shutter down behind them, locking the world out of his shop. He loved it more at these quiet times than at any other. The lights in the showroom were switched on. A bevy of insects fluttered around the bulbs, the din of their beating wings filling the vacuum left by the departing chatter of the day. The saris had been folded away, chairs stacked, floor swept. The dying embers of sunlight illuminated his corner. Quickly, Moyur put on the bra, lining the inside of the cups with folded underpants. Once he had plumped them up to his satisfaction, he put on a black sequined blouse and smoothed out any visible bumps. Moyur did not have a petticoat, so he kept his trousers on and used it to tuck the sari into. His cheeks still folded into dimples when he smiled, and his eyes were soft and luminous. He could very easily have been mistaken for a young woman. Moyur stood in front of the mirror and smiled. A blush spread to his cheeks. It suited him. It really suited him. He angled his body to peer at himself from behind and then from the side. He lifted the turquoise achul over his head and looked straight at his reflection. Moyur, Moyur, Moyur. He recited his name out loud, but where he is, on the fringes of our identities, he loses his way sometimes between where Moyur has a meaning and where we begin. Moyur moved his arms delicately in the manner of silver screen nymphets. On cue, his hips began rocking, his torso swayed, and Moyur danced out of compulsion. There, in the golden orange half-light, he had become a splendid, euphoric being, with kajal-rimmed almond eyes and lips as red as sindoor. Behind him, he saw in the mirror the fleeting presence of another soul. She was just as splendid, but quieter. She looked like him, she moved like him, and she wept, the girl child.
Thank you, Ishani. I think I speak on behalf of all of us that we had goosebumps the entire time both Shyam and Ishani read. And it sort of connects with what we just mentioned earlier. You know, you think about something like draping a sari, which perhaps sounds so simplistic that, you know, it's a garment and you're putting it on and you're looking beautiful. But for some people, navigating these spaces, navigating the closet, navigating their ornaments, their clothing, their walk, everything, it's a decision that you have to make wherein you put yourself in a position of vulnerability. And yet, you very bravely and rightfully so embrace that fluidity because you deserve to. And there is nobody in the world that should tell you you cannot wear a sari. And that's just the start. We spoke about the last few years. We have 5 minutes left of the conversation. We'll open it up to the audience. Anish, where do you see the queer movement going? And this is a question for all of us. You know, we are talking about, with each day, recognizing our privilege, understanding the spaces that we are also coming and speaking from. I mean, these terminologies that we use so easily, this vocabulary is not even accessible to so many queer folks across the world. We have to be very, very aware of the caste and class hierarchies that also come into play. So, and of course, you talked about the trans movement too, Shyam. You also spoke about the trans movement. So, what is next? Where are we going, Anish?
Oh God, that's a big question, yeah, Eric. You know, I think in many ways, it's very heartening to see so many younger queer people being able to come out so much earlier than ever before. I was speaking at my own high school a couple of years ago, and there were like 10 queer kids in the audience and 3 couples. And I said, "Excuse me? Who is letting you do all of this? Don't your teachers know?" And in many ways, I think there are changes happening incrementally, of course, across the country. I think you're seeing a lot of conversations around queerness taking place outside of urban areas, into tier 2 and tier 3 cities. I think at the same time, there is a complete breakdown in any sense of community, right? I think we've completely abandoned, particularly after the pandemic, spaces of care, you know, spaces of community. We don't have spaces in which younger queer kids can go up to older mentors for advice, for assistance, for any sort of guidance. And I think the crumbling of those spaces that were so essential to me, and queer mentors who were so important to me coming out and being comfortable with my own identity, that lack of spaces, that lack of care worries me. And the transformation of queerness, the commodification of queerness into something that then gets whirled into this question of representation and this question of, you know, acceptance, under sort of scores the lack of conversations around its central positioning as a vehicle of care, as a sort of creation of sense of community. And in the years that come, I really hope that we can find that care, not for us, but for those who've come after.
Absolutely. Finding care, Shyam.
Well, I mean, I think we have to look at it as one country at a time. So for us, of course, in Canada, it's the fear of the sort of spreading of right-wing ideology from the States, particularly around trying to control libraries and who can read what. So there's been, fortunately, librarians actually quite resistant, you know, they can fight back. And so, but I think it's also time for, you know, yeah, for digging down a bit. I mean, I haven't worn a gay button since the 90s, but I just started to wear it again because I thought, you know, we need to stand up and be counted again, unfortunately. And it's nice to do it. I mean, I was teaching at York University, it's a large South Asian population. I could just see all the young people sort of looking at me like this old guy, you know, with his queer badge, you know, which I think that that's really important to do. So I don't really have a larger sense of where things are going, but I'm just saying right now, let's do what we can.
Ishani.
So, as I feel a little bit of hesitation, I suppose, in answering that question. I don't self-identify as queer. So I'm going to answer that question more from the point of view of, I suppose, gender, because that was something that was really important to me in writing this book, and actually the constraints placed on all of the characters by this construct of gender. And actually, I've found gender as a construct, one that has been used really more than anything to control people's potential, control their freedoms. And I would hope that the centrality of gender as a pillar of identity sort of is gradually perhaps shifts so that it becomes more of a footnote, and there are the kind of the plethora of other aspects that people have are able to sort of take more center stage. And I think bringing it back to women, you know, gender has always been an instrument of control for women's potential. And for me, I think there is a resonance there, and I would like to see it, you know, the expression being a little bit more democratized for people to be who they want to be within that. Thanks.
Thank you, Ishani. The three words that come to me from what the three of them said is construct, community, and care. And we will open it up to the audience now, but before we do that, just a note of gratitude. We realize that we are right now a product of years and years of movements, of people, of writings, of activism, of a lot of political actions. And this is our way of saying thank you for letting us do this. Thank you that we are on stage here speaking about this. And this is for every queer person out there. And when I say queer, I do not mean just somebody who identifies with the LGBTQIA plus community. Queer is not conforming. It is not being a part of this heteronormative structure. This is for each one of you. You're valid. You exist. Your stories are here. And you are as important as anybody else. Embrace your fluidity and live fully. So thank you so much yet again. We have 7-8 minutes left. I see a hand over there. We'll take 3 questions. If the mic could please go to, yes.
Good afternoon. My name is Shikhar, and my question is to Shyam Selvadurai. Could you talk a bit about the intersectionality of ethnicity and sexuality? Because in your book, you do mention the Sinhala Tamil tensions, and I believe your background is also like one of your parents is Sinhala and the other Tamil. And second, in Sri Lanka, Article 365 is still there. And I was speaking to a Sri Lankan lawyer last year, and they told me that the Supreme Court cannot strike it down. The Sri Lankan Parliament has to do it. So how do you feel about that? And the first question about intersectionality. Thank you.
Well, I mean, in Funny Boy, and actually even in some of the other novels, there's this kind of way in which I'm challenging any kind of categorization, whether it's Sinhala or Tamil or gay or straight or whether boy or girl. What I'm trying to say is that that these categories feel like constructs, and that they're imposed on us by the state or by the sort of the rebel movement, and then so that RG experiences it like that there's this idea that you're supposed to be this person, but you're not this person. You're not really Tamil, whatever Tamil means. You're actually the person. You have more in common with this Sinhalese boy, and you fall in love with him, but you don't actually have anything in common with the guy who comes from the north, the heartland of Tamil culture. So I'm just trying to really kind of do what fiction does really well, which is go to the personal experience and the emotional experience, and then try to use that to, in a sense, queer these categories, whatever they are. And so that's the first question. I think I hopefully answered that. With this, unfortunately, our constitution is different. It has to be changed by parliament, which is very dismaying. And they promised to recently, and everybody got excited, but politicians are great about putting the bill, and then it sits and sits and sits and sits and sits. So it's just sitting there. So I don't really know. I mean, I just have to hope, because when I wrote Funny Boy, I thought that somebody in Sri Lanka, a queer reader, will read it in Sri Lanka when I'm dead, or I never expected that it would be published immediately by Penguin India and be available. I never expected it would be translated into Sinhala and become sort of this big book for people who first experience themselves in this book. I just never expected that. So I just live in hope, because as a writer, there is no other option for me but to live in hope. Otherwise, it just becomes misery, and then you end up being a polemical writer, which I don't really want to be.
Thank you. Over here in the front, please.
Thank you. It was very enlightening program. I have always remained privileged because I belong to the majority, but I have a few questions. I do not know whether I'll be able to put it up properly. People's sexual orientation is something very personal and natural. So if it is coming naturally to you, why should you call yourselves queer people? I mean, it must be a natural process, and as Ishani mentioned, you will be assessed in different areas as per your performances, your work, but just grouping yourselves as queer, I mean, I think the term is not very encouraging. Thank you.
Shall I take that? I mean, yes, in an ideal world, wouldn't it be lovely not to have to call yourself anything? And actually, in ancient India, there is no term for gay or lesbian or queer, certainly in the Buddha's time. And this is because it wasn't an issue. It was just an alternate, you had a heterosexual, I mean, a structure of family and having children and all that, but this could exist side by side. There's no word for it because it was just there. So yes, of course, it would in an ideal world, but we don't live in that world, so we have to kind of organize ourselves and language for human beings is a very, very important way of thinking of ourselves. Even in prayer, it's language that gets us into the space, right? The meditative space. So I think that it just is. I mean, we don't want it. We would love not to be it, but here we are. And so we have to organize and fight back, and language is a very important part of it.
Yes, Ishani, would you like to?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, actually, really interesting, because, this is a queer conversation. I've said already I don't identify as queer, but here I am. We are expanding. It's an inclusive conversation, and I think that's something to be celebrated. The other thing I wanted to say is not so much from the point of view of the word queer, but again, going back to this construct of being a woman, I've often thought, well, actually, it's quite limiting. It is a construct that seeks to control, but equally, it has a whole history and that word also embodies a fight for equality. It embodies, legacies of oppression and of struggle. And so there is something about corralling around the word. I'm speaking about woman here, but there are corollaries. And therefore, it's important to sort of respect that terminology as well, and just kind of appreciate that there are tensions in how we use them, but also kind of manage those tensions because they play an important part.
And I just want to quickly push back a little against this as well, because I've always been very uncomfortable with the idea of queerness being accepted only because it's natural or that you're born with it. To me, that is a pathologization of queerness and a sense of acceptance that comes not from a grounding of these principles in basic value for someone else's right to do whatever they please, but in this certain sort of medicalized fashion where you're accepted because this is who you are. And that again comes to the very heart of desire, right? That this policing of desire that comes from a worry that this is unnatural and the only solution to it is that it should become natural. And so I think when you start thinking of desire that way, that the only reason you're to be accepted is because it's natural, you're born this way, it warps desire for queerness in a very weird and to me, not very productive way. And so I think queerness is a choice. I think to identify as queer is to fall into, as you said, a legacy of fighting back against that policing of desire. And in many ways, Shyam, I disagree, right? We're sitting in India, and it's not that India has been a haven for queer people. I think there is a narrative that is unfortunately being constructed today, that this is a country that was very accepting of queerness, when in reality it wasn't. That queerness has transformed and become specifically policed after colonization, but has remained policed earlier as well, in many ways, shapes and forms, in different ways, shapes and forms. So I think also putting us in that genealogy of having always existed on the margins and then having almost sort of insurgent love that goes against these sort of barricades and restrictions that morph over ages but remain in place, to me sometimes is also what is important about queerness.
Yes, you're right. You're right about that. And also, in a sense, because patriarchy was so strong, it was almost like it was irrelevant.
Yeah.
Yes, I agree totally.
The buzzer has spoken. We don't have any more time for questions, but this conversation is called Queer Conversation, so the conversation must go on even off the stage. And just to finish off to that question, yes, it would be ideal. Language is very important, though, and it reminds me of the time when somebody said, well, we get it, you're queer, why do you need a pride parade though? And if there is a gay pride parade, why can't there be a pride parade for straight people? And I said, have you ever seen an Indian marriage? Every Indian marriage is a pride parade for straight people. We get one day. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Anish. Thank you, Shyam. Thank you, Ishani. It was wonderful.
Wow.